There are in history what you would call plastic hours. The philosopher Gershom Scholem had once said, namely, crucial moments when it is possible to act. If you move then, something happens. In such moments, an ossified social order suddenly turns pliable. Prolonged stasis gives way to motion, and people dare to hope. Plastic hours are very rare. They require the right alignment of public opinion, political power, and events, usually a crisis. They depend on social mobilization and leadership. They can come and go unnoticed or wasted. Nothing happens unless you move upon it. Are we living in a plastic hour? It certainly feels that way. Beneath the dreary furor of the furor of the partisan ways, most Americans agree on fundamental issues facing the country. Large majorities say that the government should ensure some form of universal health care, that it should do more to mitigate global warming, and that the rich should pay higher taxes. That racial inequality is a significant problem that we're facing, and that workers should have the right to join unions. That immigrants are a good thing for American life, and that the federal government is plagued by corruption. These majorities have remained strong for years. The readiness, the demand for action is new. What explains it? Nearly. What explains all this? Nearly 4 years of a corrupt, bigoted, and inept fake squatter who betrayed his promise to champion ordinary Americans, the arrival of an influential new generation, the millennials, who grew up with failed wars, weakened institutions, and blighted economic prospects, and basically making them both more cynical and more utopian than their parents. Collective ills that go untreated year after year are so bone deep and chronic that we assume that they're permanent. From income inequality, feckless government and police abuse, to a shredded social fabric and a poisonous public discourse that verges on national cognitive decline. Then this year, a series of crises that seemed to come out of nowhere like a flurry of sucker punches, but that arose straight from those ills and exposed the failures of the American society to the world. The year 2020 began with an impeachment trial that led to an acquittal, despite the fake squatter's obvious guilt. Then came the pandemic. Chaotic hospital wards, ghost cities, lies and conspiracy theories from the White House, mass death, mass unemployment, police killings, nationwide protest, more sickness, more death, more economic despair, and the disruption of normal life without end. Still ahead lies an election on whose outcome everything depends on. Now jump back to the year 1968, with which, for concentrated drama, 2020 is sometimes compared to. It marked the end of an era of reform and the start of conservative action that resonated for decades. In 1968, the core phenomenon was the collapse of order. In 2020, it is the absence of solidarity. Even with majorities agreeing on central issues, there's little sense of being in this together. The United States is world famously individualistic, and in the past half century has seen the expansion of freedom in every direction, which includes personal, social, financial, and technological stuff. But the pandemic demonstrates almost scientifically the limits of individualism. Everyone is vulnerable. Everyone's health depends on the health of others. No one is safe unless everyone takes responsibility for the welfare of others. No person, community, or state can withstand the plague without a competent and active national government. The story of the coronavirus in this country is a sequence of moments when this lesson broke down, when politicians spurred experts, governors reopened their states too soon, and crowds liberated themselves in Klan rallies and bars. The graph that shows the course of new infections in the United States gradually falling in late spring, then rising sharply in summer, is an illustration of both ineffectual leadership and a failed ideology. Shame is not the emotion that Americans readily indulge. Like the spectacle of the national coronavirus case rate surging ahead of India's and Brazil's, while it declined in most rich countries has produced a wave of self-disgust here, and pity and contempt abroad. We're at the moment where, because of COVID-19, it is reserved for anybody who has eyes to see that the systems we are committed to are inadequate and have collapsed. Maurice Mitchell, the director of the Democratic Working Families Party, had said. So now almost all 300+ million people of us are in this moment of despair, asking ourselves questions that are usually the province of the academy. Philosophical, basically, questions. Who am I in relation to my society? What is the role of government, and what does an economy do? The brutal statistics that count the jobless, hungry, evicted, sick, and dead have forced a rethinking of our political and societal and social arrangements. The numbers are a daily provocation for change, radical change. I think we are at a hinge moment in history. It's one of those moments that arises every 50 years or so, said Senator Michael Bennet of Colorado. We have the opportunity to set the stage for decades of progressive work that can improve the lives of tens of millions of Americans. The crises of 2020 could become the catalytic agent of a national transformation. Hold on a second, just dropped something. Oh, here we go. Here, yeah. Nothing about this opportunity is inevitable, or even likely. The election could end in confusion and chaos, or in another stunning upset for Fat-Ass 45 and his party. If Joe Biden wins, a continued Republican Senate majority could obstruct his policies even more than a Republican minority did try to do to the then-President Barack Obama. Even a Democratic White House and Congress could encounter ferocious resistance from an opposition party and conservative infrastructure grasping for lost power. Pressure from organized money in the worlds of finance and tech could sap the Democrats' reformist zeal. The Democrats' penchant for splitism could break the party into warring factions on a deeper level, or institutions might have calcified to the point that they're no longer able to realize far-reaching reforms. The public could lapse back into cynicism, and distrust made all the more enervating by raised expectations. Eventually, the country will need a sane and healthy Republican Party, which I don't expect to see that anytime soon. But for any kind of national renewal to take place, the Republicans must first suffer a crushing defeat in November. A Democratic administration and Congress must quickly pass bold legislation for economic relief, job creation, social protections, and voting rights. But a new era won't arrive like a pendulum that swings according to the laws of physics. It will take more than the triumph of a candidate, a party, or even a sweeping agenda. The obstacles are greater than just politics, and so is the opportunity. Our collapse is so complete that the field lies open. The philosophical questions brought on by despair allow us to reimagine what kind of country we can be in. The familiar narratives are used up. The dried-out words stick in our mouths for change to endure, for national shame to become pride. We need a radical agenda with a patriotic spirit. We have to revive the one thing that has ever held together this sprawling, multiplicious country, democratic faith. The presidential primaries that opened the year gave an impression of bitter disagreement among the Democratic candidates. Hours of televised debate time were consumed with the merits of Medicare for all versus Medicare for who all want it. The difference between treating undocumented immigrants humanely and decriminalizing the southern border crossings, the intricacies of Biden's position, and busing in the 1970s. Today, those arguments seem like a irrelevant scholastic exercise. One notable effect of this year's crisis has been to forge broad Democratic support for the most ambitious domestic policy agenda since the Great Society, with Biden as its unlikely standard bearer. The coronavirus arrived just as Biden was wrapping up the Democratic nomination in March. By mid-April, 30,000 Americans had died and 22 million were out of work. A group of advisors had begun speaking to the candidate by phone and video conference about his priorities for fighting both catastrophes. The advisors then turned for ideas to people outside the campaign and labor unions, universities, think tanks, and small businesses. In early May, Neera Tanden, who is the president of the Democratic Center for American Progress, wrote an essay called "A New Social Contract for the 21st Century." She sent a draft to the Biden campaign, which received it favorably. Her argument came directly from the experience of the pandemic. Our response to this virus is only as strong as our weakest link. It binds the fates together, more so than any economic or natural disaster. Tanden proposed revising the deal among citizens, corporations, and the state in ways that address the weakness exposed by COVID-19. A new social contract would give more protections to individuals in the form of universal benefits, paid family and medical leave, paid sick days, healthcare with the option of joining Medicare. It would demand more responsibility from corporations, obliging them to revise their charters and to take into account the interest of workers and local communities as much as those of shareholders who bear the economic risk only until a financial crisis or pandemic necessitates a taxpayer bailout. And it would require enormous amounts of government spending to end mass unemployment by creating millions of jobs in manufacturing, caregiving, education, and clean energy. Tandon framed her policy ideas as an updating of the New Deal, the original social contract that significantly strengthened the role of government in order to shift the burden of economic risk from the individual to the collective. The ideas in Tandon's essay are not new. Most of them have been circulating for years in policy papers that are put out by Democratic think tanks and in the stillborn bills of congressional Democrats. The philosophical basis goes back at least a century. Political transformations don't happen when a blindly original insight flashes across the sky. The New Deal itself, for all of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's openness to experimentation, it mainly brought to fruition seeds that had been planted by populists and progressives over the previous 4 decades. The Reagan Revolution realized realized conservative ideas that had originated in the period after World War II. In the face of institutional inertia, politics requires a long game, something that the modern American right has to understand better than the Democrats. Milton Friedman, an intellectual force behind Reaganism, once wrote, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available only until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable." While Biden's campaign was still formulating its domestic policies, George Floyd was killed by a Minneapolis police officer, and the country erupted in protest against racial injustice. The vice president looked at that and said, how I found in the face of these will be presidency defining. Jake Sullivan, a senior advisor, said, "I want a response that meets the moment, and it is true who I have been, and is true to who I have been in the campaign and over my career." In the primaries, Biden had presented himself as the candidate of the Obama years. But the historical clock never rewinds, and the status quo ante is unequal to the desperate now. In response to the pandemic and the protests, Biden's lines changed. Over the summer, as the virus surged, the recession deepened, and the streets filled, Biden gave a series of speeches in which he laid out the heart of his economic plan under the rubric build back better. For decades, political leaders have grasped for programmatic brand name as memorable as New Deal, Great Society, but who remembers Bill Clinton's New Covenant, George W. Bush's Ownership Society, or Barack Obama's New Foundation? They soon vanished because they never came to life in transformative legislation. Slogans stick when they're attached to programs that change the country. There would never be such a thing as Bidenism, because Biden himself has no ideology, no politics distinctly his own, but his policies deserve a more memorable name. Quoting a Depression-era poem by Langston Hughes and sticking to the incumbent, Biden could call his agenda "Make America Again." The words don't order us back like Trump's to a glorious age, or like fat ass 45s to a glorious age that never was. They speak to an idea that has to be continuously renewed. America was never America to me, and yet I swear this oath America will be. The scale of Biden's agenda is breathtaking. At its center is a huge jobs program. A Biden administration would invest $2 trillion in infrastructure and clean energy. He proposes creating 3 million jobs in early education, child care, elderly care, sectors usually regarded as soft and neglected by presidential candidates, while raising their pay and status. This economic crisis has hit women the hardest. Sullivan said that these care jobs are primarily jobs filled by women, and disproportionately women of color and immigrant women, but they don't pay a fair wage, and the opportunities to advance aren't there. This is a big, ambitious, bold proposal, not an afterthought, but at the core, another $700 billion would go to stimulating demand and innovation and domestic manufacturing for a range of essential industries such as medical supplies, microelectronics, and artificial intelligence. Some $30 billion would go to a minority-owned business as part of a large effort to reduce the racial wealth gap. Biden is proposing industrial policy, massive targeted investment to restructure production for national goals, something that no fake president has openly embraced since the 1940s. His agenda would also give workers more power, with paid family and medical leave, paid sick days, a public option for health care, and an easier path to reorganizing and joining unions. It would also more than double the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour, a bitter point of dispute between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders in 2016. Now uncontroversial among Democrats, free trade is hard to find on the agenda. For all Biden's history as a centrist, his economic program would put an end to decades of Democratic incrementalism. Americans are more broadly democratic on economic issues than on social and cultural ones. On the latter, Biden has stayed to the Republican side of his party's activists. Reform and demilitarize police, but don't defund them. Remove Confederate statues from public places, but leave the presidential monuments. Regulate fracking, but don't ban it. Rule reparations, neither in or out. For now, opposition to Fat Ass 45 has blurred the party's fracture lines. Democrats are united behind proposals that would go further in reducing inequality and remaking the social contract than any administration in modern history has even attempted. After teams made up of Biden and Sanders advisors and allies, they hammered out a 110-page policy platform. Sanders had said, "I think the compromise that they came up with, if implemented, will make Biden the most progressive president since Franklin Roosevelt." At one point, Biden sidled up to the comparison. "I don't think we've reached a point, a real inflection in American history, and I don't believe it's unlike what Roosevelt was met with," he said in July. "I think we have an opportunity to make some really systemic change. Something's happening here, it really is. The American people are going, whoa, come on, we've got to do something. This is not the stirring language of a missionary leader or the doctrinaire rhetoric of an ideologue. It's the prosaic talk of career politicians shrewd enough to realize that he might have greatness thrust upon him. I think he's come to the realization that he can be a very consequential president," Sherrod Brown, the Democratic senator from Ohio, told us. Excuse me. After alluding to the New Deal, Biden dropped the reference. His campaign seems weary of ideological framings that might alarm suburban mall shoppers in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. Jake Sullivan owned a different, less partisan Roosevelt analogy: the mobilization for public investment during World War II. The vice president's metric really is, how do we build monuments behind far-reaching, ambitious programs that actually are matched to the moment, Sullivan said, without having them take on a particular ideological stripe. Biden has no particular ideological stripe. He has always been comfortable at the center of his party, and the party moved Democratic. The facts moved Democratic, and Biden moved with them. But Barack Obama ran as a visionary and governed as a technocrat, a change that ultimately delusioned younger and more progressive Americans. Biden might make the same journey in reverse. We had some people had asked a guy named Ted Kaufman, who had advised Biden since the first Senate race in 1972, briefly filled his Senate seat when Biden became vice president, and now runs the campaign's transitioning planning. Whether his boss is undergoing what they call a late-in-life ideological conversion, I don't think so at all, Kaufman said, but what he's always done, if you go back and look at every single position he took, what Biden talks about are things that can happen. He would not get up and promise something and not believe that he's going to get it done. I don't care if we got the Senate back. If we got 59 senators or 60, you cannot pass Medicare for all. His positions in the primary were left out of center at the minimum. The big difference between him and everybody else running, he's not going to promise something he can't deliver on. Biden sees his first task at stabilizing the country, not creating more upheaval. The main thing is to get back to normal, Kaufman said. It's the old addition by subtraction. Having someone get up in the morning who says, let's try and get the country back together, that's the best way to deal with COVID-19 every day. The Biden White House would be a struggle between his instinct to reach for familiar policies or personnel and the imperative to think and act anew. The conventional metaphor for new fake presidents is financial. Victory gives them a certain amount of political capital, and they have to decide how to spend it. Gradually it dwindles. The sum is finite and usually largest at the start. But there's a different way to think about a Biden presidency. His first task would not be husband and his limited capital wisely, but to take a long stalled real call, get into the motion, and quickly speed up. He has to show that government can do big things before corporate money to organize and to co-opt him, and habitual public cynicism buries him. If Republicans lose the Senate, they will rediscover their mislaid principles as a deficit hawks and use the filibuster to obstruct Biden's agenda. Then the Democrats would have to pack a great deal of policy into reconciliation bill, which allows for the passage of budget-related legislation. via a simple majority. One of our Senate Democrats could vote to end the filibuster. Many of them seemed open to killing, but we got to eliminate the filibuster, Brown said. I don't know if it has any unanimity, but I've not talked to anybody that says I don't want to do it. Democrats might even arrange it as an execution by bringing up a popular and historically charged bill, such as the one that addresses the voting rights or police accountability, and daring Republicans to align themselves with the Democrats who filibustered civil rights. Michael Bennet has spent his last decade in the Senate watching the world's greatest deliberative body achieve next to nothing. Majority Leader Moscow Mitch has basically destroyed the Senate. He's turned it into nothing more than an employment agency, Bennett said. If people continue for their own political reasons to make it impossible for the majority to exercise its will, filibuster reform may have to be on the table. Even Biden, an inveterate institutionalist, has suggested that filibuster reform might be necessary. Bennett, who's a center Democrat from a purple state, envisions a more progressive agenda than any modern president has pursued, and it would also be widely popular with the American people. He believes that Congress should build political momentum by passing key legislation early on, with each breakthrough making the next one more and not less thinkable. Enact paid family and medical leave, double the federal minimum wage, reverse the fat-ass 45 tax cuts for the rich and corporations while giving the middle class a tax cut, hold police accountable, increase teacher pay, fund universal preschool, move to universal health care care through a public option. At the start of the previous congressional session, the House introduced H.R. 1, a bill that would have strengthened democracy by, among other things, enacting the same-day voter registration and tightening ethics rules for members of Congress. H.R. 1 died in the Senate before it could be vetoed by Fat-Ass 45. Both Bennett and Tandon said that they hoped that the next Congress will immediately take it up again, which would signal a commitment to political reform. Tandon argued that H.R. 1, with its voting rights provisions, would begin to loosen Republicans' undemocratic hold on power, which is based on a strategy of making it even harder for citizens, especially poor Black and Latino Americans, to vote, before the party had time to reorganize for a counterattack. Everything on that list, any Democrat running for the House of Representatives could support it, Bennett said. Therefore, it's something that could probably ultimately get passed. Moderate Democratic senators could support it. It would make a massive difference in the lives of working Americans and poor Americans. What we're talking about is an agenda that's more ambitious than any since Lyndon Johnson was president. There were three eras of reform in the United States in the 20th century. A historical moment has elements of each of them. A new period of reform would need to bring together the best values of all three. The progressive era at the beginning of the century was the least ideologically distinct of them. With no obvious leader, faction, or defining issue, currents of progressivism ran through both of the major parties while absorbing ideas from the populist and socialist, and through every region of the country. In local, decentralized bursts of reform, progressivism was more an impulse than a program, a moral awakening among mostly the middle-class Americans to the sense that the country had drifted from its democratic moorings. Their chief concerns were corporate power, corruption at every level of government, and the shame of the cities. As the muckraker Lincoln Stevens had said, urban losses, slums, and sweatshops, the new conditions of modern life, industrialization, technological change, mass immigration, galvanized them to act. But they were hardly revolutionaries. Their main answer to social ills was to create better citizens. We are unsettled to the very roots of our being, Walter Lippmann wrote in 1914 in his Progressive Manifesto, Drift and Mastery. There isn't a human relation, whether it contains a parent and child, husband and wife, worker and employer, that doesn't move in a strange situation. Lippmann proposed bringing the destabilizing a new freedom of modern life under the purposeful control of science, experts, managers, forward-thinking leaders. But in the brilliant survey of American life, Black Americans are scarcely mentioned. Most progressives, even muckraking journalists, were blind to racial injustice, and some, like Woodrow Wilson, is the best known, were outright racist and eugenicists. Rather than build on the achievements of Reconstruction, that earlier ill-fated reform era, progressivism set out to reinvigorate a democracy of white Americans. The New Deal, propelled by the the greatest economic crisis in American history, turned many progressive ideas into national realities, including unemployment insurance, minimum wage, and collective bargaining rights. The labor movement and the Communist Party created interracial alliances, but Roosevelt's national programs were enacted by a Congress that left Jim Crow in place while limiting protections for black and other disenfranchised Americans, domestic workers, farm workers, the intermittently employed workers continue to fall through these holes in the safety net to this day. In our latest version of the Depression, the civil rights movement in the early to mid 1960s produced a burst of creativity in Lyndon B. Johnson's administration. Lyndon Johnson was a creature of the Senate, an institutional figure in a very good and bad way, and failed presidential candidate whose career seemed to have come to an end in the purgatory of the vice presidency. When he succeeded John F. Kennedy, another president in the technocrat as visionary mold, Johnson was scorned by the Eastern Democrats as a crude big-eared Texan, a party hack, and a bigot. But he took Kennedy's stalled agenda on civil rights and poverty and realized it in the most rigorous set of laws and actions for social justice in America since the 1930s. Johnson had two advantages over Kennedy: unparalleled knowledge of Congress and an atmosphere of crisis and a mobilization in the streets. He also benefited from the electoral mandate in 1964. The analogies to Biden are not hard to see. Just as the New Deal naturalized local progressive ideas, the Great Society tried to consummate the New Deal for all Americans, but it soon disintegrated amid urban riots, big Republican gains in the 1966 midterm elections, and the catastrophe during the Vietnam War. The Coalition for Reform, civil rights groups, unions, peace marches, academic experts, Democratic politicians collapsed as the country exploded, and the Democrats splintered into fragments that grew more and more extreme. Like the progressive era, our age is marked by monopolistic corporate power that has created immense inequality and threatens democracy itself. Like the 1930s, our decade has begun with mass unemployment and vivid demonstrations of the vulnerability of American workers. Like the 1960s, our moment is animated by a dynamic young generation passionately inflamed by ongoing racial justice. Most American reform movements carry a strain of Puritanism, a zeal for personal self-correction so powerful that it can sometimes replace the effort to make concrete changes to material conditions. These movements began with protests from below by impoverished farmers, striking workers, disenfranchised black Southerners, and rise up into the middle class, which adopts the cause with what the historian Richard Hofstadter wrote of the progressives. He called them a rather strenuous moral purgation. A personal sense of guilt precedes a quasi-religious fervor directed toward social and political ills and a longing for redemption and solidarity with the downtrodden. Progressive crusaders ventured into the slums to expose the squalid conditions of immigrant life. In the 1930s, bourgeois communists and fellow travelers exalted the proletariat and sacrificed intellectual independence to the iron will of the party. In the 1960s, white college students joined the struggle for black freedom in the South and then decided that they required their own liberation, too, by means of taking over campuses and curricula. And then it goes on and on and on, so I'm not going to have time to read all of it, but yeah. But you get the idea. But we are